Welcome to another podcast by the Seasonal Magazine. Today we have with us Dr. Radhika Kapoor. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor.
Thank you for having me, Angita.
Professor, we'll start off with the fact that there was already a rising trend of unemployment in the country, which is only magnified due to the crisis. What does it mean for the formal and the informal sector of the economy? And what can we expect in the coming quarters?
So even before we went into the COVID crisis, we were grappling with the serious problem of unemployment and underemployment. In 2017-18, we actually clocked the highest unemployment rate in the last 5 years at about 6.1%. Employment, the fact that large proportions of the workforce were trapped in low-paying, low-productivity jobs, in particular in the informal sector. Now, both the COVID and the lockdown shock, because there was a medical shock and there was the shock of the lockdown, they have aggravated that problem. They posed an unprecedented shock to the labor market. And importantly, the effect of that shock has not been uniform across all types of workers. A disproportionate burden of the shock was borne by those who were in the informal sector, in particular, daily casual workers, the self-employed, who are largely own-account workers, or the unpaid family workers. So we know that in the month of April, estimates from CMIE tell us that about 122 million jobs were lost in that month in the immediate aftermath of the lockdown. And 90 million of these jobs losses were accounted for by daily wage workers and self-employed. So that in itself is a statistic which reflects that a disproportionate burden of the shock was borne by informal sector workers. And this is not surprising because they are working in the most precarious work arrangements. They are working in sectors which have been hardest hit by the lockdown. The kind of work that they are engaged in does not give them the luxury of doing, work from home or remote work. And most of these people are basically, the lesser educated, those who are at the bottom deciles, or both in terms of income and in terms of their education. So these are also people who don't have the financial wherewithal to actually go through this period of distress. And that is why now what we are seeing is that we're actually seeing unemployment rates starting to decline, where we saw unemployment rates in the range of about 24 to 27% in the months of April and May. Now CMI data is telling us that in June, the all India unemployment rate was something in the range of 10 to 11%. And that's basically because all these informal sector workers who lost their jobs or who were not able to work because of lockdown restrictions, they actually can't afford to remain unemployed anymore. And as mobility restrictions have eased and lockdown restrictions have eased, they are now stepping out and trying to find whatever work they can. Though this work at this point is probably offering them, reduced hours of work, lower earnings. So they are underemployed. So the problem of underemployment has actually got exacerbated. And the unemployment problem will also persist for a while. But at this point, we are seeing this decline in the unemployment rate, largely because most of the workforce can't afford to remain unemployed.
And what can we expect further on? Like, do you have any sort of idea as to what we can say?
I would expect the unemployment rate maybe to decline a bit more in the quarters to come. But, even at the best of times, the open unemployment rate doesn't tell us very much about what is happening in the labor market in a country like India, because there is a significant amount of underemployment. So I would expect the problem of underemployment to get aggravated. Earnings will decline considerably because people will be willing to work for a lot less than they were before the lockdown. The terms of employment will be more precarious. They will have reduced hours of work, but we might not see the unemployment rate going back to a very high level. The open unemployment rate will stay probably in the range of 10 to 11%, a bit higher than what it was before the crisis struck.
And what do you think the lockdown and the crisis has done to women and other minorities who are considered to be more vulnerable?
To begin with, be it women or minorities, they are largely engaged in work, in employment arrangements which are more precarious, which are more vulnerable to begin with. And therefore, to the extent that the COVID-19 shock and the lockdown shock disproportionately impacted those who were in these vulnerable work arrangements, these groups are bound to be impacted more. We don't have much hard data at this point to tell us, how they were exactly impacted. There is some estimates that have come from CMI, which Professor Ashwini Deshpande at Ashoka University has worked on. And she has estimated using CMI data that for women, conditional on the fact that they were employed before the lockdown, they are 20% more likely to have lost their jobs compared to men. So therefore, in absolute terms, we might see that men will lose more jobs compared to women in absolute terms, because already there's significant gender divide in the labor market. But if you condition for whether a person was employed before the crisis struck, women definitely are more disproportionately impacted. And also, women are, again, they've been engaged in a lot of frontline activities, in a lot of risky activities. So that makes things harder for them. And there is a disproportionate burden of the unpaid care work that is being done in the family at this point. Given that we are going through this period of lockdown in some form or the other, puts more challenge on women. So definitely, women stand to lose a lot. And also going forward, because we know that there's going to be a serious challenge of jobs, good jobs. There are not going to be enough of those jobs. And naturally, men will get more of those jobs compared to women. So the price was halted, and so production could not happen. But then there were a whole host of supply side disruptions. Those supply side disruptions could happen externally because you were getting imports from abroad, or it could happen because even, domestic supply chains were hit. And then there was also a demand shock. And the demand shock was, booming in the Indian economy even before COVID-19 struck. And that has obviously gotten exacerbated at this point as people have lost their jobs, they've lost incomes. So naturally, demand will decline further. So, manufacturing definitely has been hit by a series, by these three shocks concomitantly. But, actually the manufacturing sector in India has not performed really well. If you look at the long-term performance, it's now almost 3 decades since the reforms of 1991. And manufacturing continues to account for just about 12% of total employment in manufacturing, of 12% of total employment in India. So it's not as if the manufacturing sector went in to the shock performing really well, but it has been hit quite severely. And to the extent that, I believe that the manufacturing sector has to be a very important driver of both growth and job creation. In a country like India, at this point in its development experience, this makes things much harder for us.
A lot of experts have been alleging that the manufacturing sector growth, whatever it has been capital driven. Do you agree? And what kind of policies are there that allow the growth to be driven by labor?
So this is absolutely correct. If you look at the data for the manufacturing sector per se, you will find that the sectors that have performed well within manufacturing are basically capital intensive and skill intensive sectors. And, these sectors have outperformed labor intensive sectors, which is actually quite surprising, because being a labor surplus economy, our comparative advantage should have in fact laden labor intensive industries, but that has not been the case. And many would have us believe that it is a consequence of our so-called rigid labor regulatory regime. I, for one, don't believe that argument, because I think that though, there is a lot of rigidity de jure on paper, but de facto, there is a lot of flexibility in the labor regulatory regime. We have seen this in the form of the contractualization of the workforce, the outsourcing of activities to, smaller firms in the unregistered sector, to home-based workers. So that's not really as binding a factor as it's made out to be. But the real reason that I think that the growth has been more capital and skill intensive led is because right from the beginning, from our industrial policy regime of, since the second 5-year plan, India has always laid more emphasis on capital intensive industries. Labor intensive industries were basically, they were kept for smaller units, for the traditional sector. We had the policy of small scale reservation, where labor intensive products were reserved for smaller units. So as a result of all those policies, our labor intensive sectors have actually not got an opportunity to perform. I mean, the small scale reservation policy, they started de-reserving items from 1997 onwards, and that ended only in 2015. And I think we are still sort of bearing the consequences of that, because our labor intensive industry is still dominated basically by very small and informal units which don't enjoy economies of scale, and therefore they cannot generate employment to the extent that they should in a country like ours. So they've actually not got the kind of importance they should have in the industrial policy regime in India.
Taking from that, you recently wrote a paper of the impact of COVID-19 on the working population. What would you recommend that the government or any authority provide support to these small-scale industries or these enterprises to help retain workers, because they have not been able to retain workers, is what you're saying, right?
No, what I was describing to you right now was a more historical legacy about why labor-intensive industries have not performed so well. Now, going to what has happened in the current crisis, how do we retain workers in this moment of crisis, given that firms are facing demand-side problems, they have a liquidity crisis, they have supply-side disruptions, and at the same time, they've also faced this exodus of migrant labor, which some reports now suggest are coming back. The migrant workers are actually coming back to some of the cities. Now, the challenge of retaining these workers is actually very complex in the Indian enterprise landscape, because most of the firms are actually in the informal sector. And majority of these also are what we call own account enterprises. So own account enterprises are those which operate without any hired labor. So the firm landscape in India is basically dominated by these informal enterprises and own account enterprises. And given that they're not registered, we really don't have any mechanism of, in fact, reaching out to them. Formal enterprises, on the other hand, are easier to reach out to, and the government has taken an initiative there to try and help firms retain their workers by paying the EPF contribution of both the employer and the employee. That's 24% of the wages under the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. I mean, to my mind, given the enormity and the gravity of the crisis, I think the wage support needs to be considerably higher than 24%. And also that wage support shouldn't be restricted to just smaller firms, but also to larger firms, because this scheme basically targets formal workers. And most of the formal workers are employed in larger enterprises, not in smaller enterprises. So to actually help firms retain workers, at least the formal firms, you have to give greater wage support. For informal enterprises, it's very tricky. This is not going to work, of course, because the workers in these enterprises are not registered under schemes like EPFO, ISEC, so on and so forth. So for helping the informal enterprises, the only way to go about helping them is really through direct income support.
What can you say about the steps that are taken in the agriculture sector, where there has been a promotion of agriculture-based startups and technology-based agricultural startups? The framework for e-trading has also changed now. All of this under the purview of Atmanirbhar initiative mean for the productivity of this sector?
So I think firstly, the agricultural sector is going to be a very important sector going forward, because what is likely to happen is that the number of people employed in agriculture might see an increase, because agriculture has, some people argue that it has emerged relatively unscathed from this crisis, and agriculture will probably come out as an employer of last resort in this period of crisis. But what that also means is that if you have more people employed in the agricultural sector, but your output remains the same, then the output per person is going to decline. And we know that agricultural wages have been flat, have been sluggish going into this crisis. Starting 2014-15, the growth in agricultural wages has been very flat. So initiatives that actually help increase agricultural productivity and therefore agricultural incomes are what are absolutely critical at this point. I mean, for instance, the one step that they have taken is that actually they have allowed for sale and purchase of agricultural commodities outside the APMCs. Now, to the extent that it actually will help farmers realize better prices, it will lead to more competition, it will save the farmers from exploitation. it's a welcome step. But we also know that in a number of states, this exercise of delisting had happened long before COVID, and yet the farmer has continued to go to the mandis only and sell their produce, because in cases where they've tried to sell to the trader, sometimes they haven't got the desired price, or in the case of the COVID crisis, the traders tried to waive off 30-40% of the price and take advantage of the vulnerable position of the farmer. So it's not entirely, I don't have an unambiguous answer, because there are lessons from the past which tell us that this might not lead to higher agricultural incomes and productivities. But yes, to the extent that you're allowing for trade outside the mandis, this will give the APMCs a real chance for reform to provide better infrastructure, a more transparent environment for the farmers, and that will probably help in better price discovery and therefore enhance incomes of farmers.
There has been another dimension to the crisis, is that India already had an underutilized demographic dividend, right? So how has the COVID crisis impacted this, and what steps would you recommend that can push the economy to take advantage of this underutilized dividend?
The story of the demographic dividend is indeed the most depressing one, because we went into this this discussion started a few years ago in India about how we have the largest young population in the world, and there was this big demographic dividend that we were going to yield. But the most glaring statistic is the fact that just 50% of our working age population is in the labor force. If your labor force participation rate is a mere 50%, and for women it is a mere 24%, then really there is no talk of a demographic dividend to my mind. Because demographic dividend would happen if you have this large working age population, it's productively employed, and therefore it generates more incomes, more savings, and therefore more growth. So I think we should almost stop talking about the idea of a demographic dividend. But okay, having said that, we do have this large young population, and again, we know that youth unemployment was a problem that predates the COVID crisis. From the 2018-19 periodic labor force survey data, the unemployment rate of the youth was about 17%, and that of the educated youth, so those who have secondary education and above, was something around 24%. So the unemployment rate of the youth was already very high. And essentially, this is a consequence of the fact that the structural transformation that India has undergone has not actually generated too many jobs for this large young population. We've gone straight from a phase of agricultural-led growth to service-led growth. And even in this service-led growth model, while the growth of output and GDP has been driven by the high-end services, employment has been generated in very low-end services. And that's clearly not where the youth would want to go, or these are not the sectors that are providing them with stable employment. Essentially, most of the employment being created here is again very precarious, it's very vulnerable, be it all this talk about the gig economy. It's essentially more informal work arrangements, which put workers in an exploitative position. And COVID again is exacerbating this crisis for the youth. We don't have numbers right now for about, in this post-COVID period, what the breakdown has been. Is it the youth or the older elderly which has been impacted more? But globally, the ILO says that basically, for the youth, 4 out of 10 in the hardest hit sectors in the world globally are youth. And also, their education, their training, all of this has been impacted adversely because of this crisis. And there is a danger of this young generation becoming the lockdown generation. And given that we are the country with the largest young population in the world, this lockdown generation challenge is going to be a very serious one for us, because there's also an entire scarring effect that this has going forward in your career, because if the first job that you're going to do, is going to be something very low paid, unproductive, not secure, or you're just going to be hanging around being unemployed, then that doesn't bode very well for your future. So having said all of this, what is the solution? I think one is that we really need to focus on sectors which are labor intensive. We need to have an industrial policy that focuses on more labor-intensive sectors. which can generate more employment compared to capital intensive. So these are the sectors which have a lower capital output ratio, and work systematically towards trying to address the bottlenecks which are faced by some of the most labor intensive sectors. Because, manufacturing per se is very important for generating both jobs and for economic growth. It has the strongest backward and forward linkages with all the other sectors in the economy, be it, the services sector or the construction sector. And labor-intensive manufacturing in particular, which India has not done well on, is even more important for us at this point, because we have to create large numbers of jobs. As you were talking about this large young population, the squandered demographic dividend, we need to recognize that we need to create large number of jobs. But at the same time, it's also important to recognize that simply creating more jobs is not enough. These jobs actually have to be good jobs. They have to be secure jobs. They have to provide at least a basic minimum level of social security. Because as we're talking about this large young population, we know that about 20, 25 years from now, when this young population starts aging, then these are people who would have all been in work arrangements that would have offered them those social security benefits. So as a result of it, when they will retire, they will have no social security. And we are going to be faced with another crisis. So these two things have to happen concomitantly, labor-intensive industrialization, along with a basic minimum level of social security to make the labor market more secure.
Taking from that, we cannot really ensure securities for the urban informal or the informal sector in general. What policies can be there in order to ensure a greater safety net for those particular people?
So I think one of the most important learnings from this crisis has been that the urban poor have no safety net, really. And the conversation around safety nets has focused on rural areas mostly in India. And MG Narega has worked beautifully in terms of, in fact, MG Narega along with PDS have been really the two most effective safety nets in this moment of crisis. But urban areas have no such thing. I mean, the PDS also, on average, one could say it performs relatively better in rural areas compared to urban areas. But I think there is certainly an urgent need to give a safety net to the urban informal poor. And I think following up on MG Narega, having an urban employment guarantee program, one that not only provides employment, say for X number of days per year, but does it at a minimum wage and is linked to creation of productive assets in urban areas, could be a very effective way of providing a safety net going forward.
There has also been an observation that when the job market is on the low, there is a rise in enrollment rates in higher education. Having been a final year student, the plan is to go for masters, right? Secondary education. So do you think that this is perhaps an opportunity for policymakers to drive skill development? And if so, how do you think that can be achieved in this need for social distancing?
This is a tricky question, and it will depend on what your starting point is. Because, this is really a very unprecedented sort of crisis. And there were a lot of people who, typically you would not find on any sort of list. They would have not been on the BPL list. They would have not been on, any Jan Dhan list, anything. There were people who were doing just fine. But the effect of the shock has been so huge that now they find themselves that they just don't have any earnings. And we've seen this from various post-COVID surveys where, people say that we don't even have earnings to get by beyond one week to get our basic essentials. So I think that a lot of people who would have lost their jobs, they will not have the luxury. And a lot of youth, perhaps, who have lost their jobs will not have the luxury of actually withdrawing from the labor force and saying that let's go back and get educated. So I'm not sure if it will, lead to a rise in enrollment rates. For people who are, already, completing their degrees, say people like you who have to now decide what their next step is. I mean, of course, that you're going to be, if you are going to enter the labor market right now at this moment when we are staring at a recession, perhaps a depression, and you know that hiring rates are going to be depressed. Obviously, you are not going to find the kind of job that you would want to do, which is commensurate with your educational qualifications and will give you the kind of earnings that you think you deserve. So you might then choose to enroll in further education, but that would be possible only if you have the luxury of doing so. You know, for a lot of people who will not have that luxury of being able to, or won't be able to afford staying away from the labor market, they will be compelled to do any sort of, you know, informal work, self-employment, more precarious work to get by. And skilling, I mean, there's an initiative by the authorities in multiple states at this point to skill migrants, at least. But I don't see skilling being, you know, the focus at this point of policymakers, because let's also not forget that what this whole pandemic has done is that it's disrupted education and training as well. And there are multiple other challenges to grapple with. So I'm not sure. I mean, the kind of skilling that we're hearing about is, you know, just let's skill the migrants so that we can get them placed somewhere and give them some sort of relief and some financial cushion. But I haven't seen anything larger coming out in terms of a skilling initiative for the youth.
In that regard, what do you feel about the Atmanirbhar initiative as it allows credits to the small sectors? And how do you think it will be able to revive certain sectors of the economy?
So, I mean, what does Atmanirbhar basically mean? I think Atmanirbhar, the idea of self-reliance, is a perfectly desirable objective. To my mind, the question is, how do you actually go about achieving that self-reliance? What is that self-reliance? I mean, what do you need to do to achieve that self-reliance? What's the route that you take to achieve it? I think the critical thing is that we need to enhance our productivity and we need to enhance our competitiveness. The idea that we can become more self-reliant by resorting to a strategy of protectionism, by an import substitution strategy, is not going to get us very far. I think India has been through an entire period where it has tried and tested these kind of policies, and we know that it's not worked out very well for us. So I think the focus has to be on, yes, it has to be on turning inwards, but then what kind of reforms do we need to become more competitive, and what do we need to become more productive? I mean, why is it that a large amount of the goods which are being produced by what is the middle class or those who are even below the middle class are not being produced domestically in India? You know, why is it that we have to import t-shirts from Bangladesh? You know, apparel is a very, very labor-intensive sector, and apparel can generate a lot of jobs in India. So why is it that the Indian apparel industry is actually not done well? Now, one of the big reasons for that is because we put such a high import duty on synthetic fibers, which are an essential input in the apparel industry, that we've not allowed our apparel industry to actually become globally competitive. So, you know, these are things that we have to think of what we can do to become more globally competitive. I mean, another example, I mean, infrastructure, logistics. We know that this makes us highly uncompetitive. There was this entrepreneur who basically said that it costs 4 rupees per kilo to get cable from a town which is like 400 kilometers from Shanghai to Mumbai. And then it costs 14 rupees a kilo to get that cable transported from Mumbai to a factory in Noida. So if the costs of your logistics are going to be so high, how can we be more competitive or productive? So we have to look at, you know, be it our infrastructure bottlenecks, logistical challenges, the layers of regulations we have, labor market reforms. And by labor market reforms, I don't mean abolition of labor laws like we have seen certain states doing, but laws that actually strike a balance between the needs of industry to have some flexibility and yet give employment security to workers. Land bottlenecks. I mean, what are the key bottlenecks that are being faced internally? Doing import substitution and protectionism and putting high tariffs on what we are importing is not going to make us self-reliant in the long run for sure. It's actually going to make goods much more expensive for those who were consuming these imported goods, most of those who were in the middle class or the ones below that threshold. And we know that cohort of people is already suffering a lot in the aftermath of the crisis, because they are the ones who have borne a disproportionate impact of that crisis.
We also know that India is not very linked to the global value chains. How do you think India can sort of enter these global value chains? And before that, what impact do you think the COVID crisis would have on these global value chains?
So, we have for the longest time argued that we need to integrate into global value chains for job creation and for growth, and rightly so. But there is now this belief globally, and this is something that Danny Rodrik is also now saying, that he said recently, and I think it was in the context of India only, that basically, global value chains are going to be less important drivers of growth and job creation, at least in the medium term in a post-COVID world. Now, if that is indeed the case, then what does that mean for India? I think the strategy of focusing on export-led industrialization and global value chains might not yield the expected returns in the short to medium term for India. And therefore, we do need to turn towards where the domestic demand lies. And like I was telling you before, what is it that is being consumed domestically? And since a significant amount of that is in fact being imported from from China, from Bangladesh, how can we make those goods cheaper in India? We can make them more competitively and more productively. And also, given the fact that India is still a low middle income country, there is still considerable untapped demand for manufactured goods. And if we can tap that, I'm not saying that we don't need to integrate into global value chains, but it's a fine balance we have to strike going forward, given that there is a chance this era of hyper-globalization might be on the decline. So we do need to look at our own domestic demand also and say, how can we produce more competitively what is being produced, what is being consumed domestically.
To wrap this all up, what would you recommend as short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures to help the economy, recover from this crisis?
So I think the short term is frankly the most challenging, because what we are trying to do is somehow survive in this moment of crisis. There is so much uncertainty about how long this pandemic is going to last, what is going to be the severity of the duration. And now, as lockdowns are becoming more localized, it'll become even harder to do economic activity, because if you have, even domestic supply chains get disrupted if you're getting one component from a red zone, another from another zone, and putting it all together and selling it somewhere else, which is under a lockdown. So, the short run is, I think, has to focus basically on providing some sort of immediate relief. We know that the government has not provided any direct income support, and there is nothing to suggest that they're going to do so. So I do think that they should continue with the initiative that they're doing on the PDS, continue providing at least in-kind assistance for as long as they can, because that's at least one measure of filling in the income loss by providing in people food at subsidized or free rates. Support expanding NREGA is critical, because we are hearing reports about how so many households have already run out of their 100 days. Because we know that also when the migrant workers went back, some of them have also worked under NREGA, and since the allocation is for a household for 100 days, there is a need for ramping up that. The extension of NREGA, therefore, and also the establishment of an urban employment guarantee program and linking it to creation of productive assets. These are all things that we can think of in the short to medium term. At the same time, I think to protect low-wage workers in the formal sectors, because over the last month we've also been hearing of considerable layoffs in the formal sector, because firms are finding it facing reduced demand, so they're not being able to retain workers. I think we should continue with the support that is being given under the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, up to 24% wage support, and if that can be ramped up, I think that would be very welcome, so that at least I mean, this is important not just to help firms maintain their production when demand all of a sudden goes up, but also to prevent the separation costs that happen when workers, lose their jobs in firms. So that would be the short to medium term, I'd say. I mean, right now it's just about how do we keep our nose above the water, because we really are in a very uncertain situation, and we don't know how long this is going to last, and if it's going to get worse before it gets any better. In the long run, I think, like I've already mentioned, I mean, there are two key things to my mind. One is that you need to reorient the pattern of growth to focus on sectors which are more labor intensive, because we know we have an unemployment problem. The underemployment problem has got aggravated. So we need to have more labor intensive growth. One way is labor intensive manufacturing. Construction also offers an opportunity in that, given that there is considerable need for building of infrastructure. The construction doesn't have to be focused just in urban areas, but I'm also talking about rural areas, because that's where it's actually more labor intensive in nature. And secondly, I mean, providing social security, universal social security for all, be it in the formal sector or the informal sector, because even in the formal sector, you're seeing increasing informalization of the workforce. So we have a social security code which is talking about this idea, but it's at this particular version of the code, that is the 2019 version, is not explicitly spelled out the idea of providing a universal social protection floor. And I think that's something that we need to put in place and perhaps relook at that bill in this context. But these would be the two key takeaways.
Dr. Kapoor, thank you for enlightening us with your knowledge, and it has been a great session for me personally. I'm sure our viewers will like you the same. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.